Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Visual Studio Toolbox right here from the studio in Redmond. I'm your host, Leslie Richardson, and today I am joined by Rocky, who is fresh off of VS Live day one at the time of this recording anyway.
Yeah,
hey
that's
Rocky.
right. Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm glad to be here. Doing
Cool.
great.
Happy to have you. Thanks for coming. Such a long trek from Building 33.
I know.
I know.
I barely made it.
That's really rough, yeah. Some roadblocks you can run into on the way here. So Rocky, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I live in Minnesota, and so I flew out here, and it's cooler here than it is there, which is nice. And I've spent a long time working in the Microsoft space, writing books, speaking, that sort of thing. The last 27 plus years, I've been working on an open source project called CSLA, and throughout that time, that's been like a gateway, if you will, to Windows Forms and Web Forms and WPF and MAUI and Xamarin, everything, right? All the UI frameworks and all the back-end technologies that have come and gone over the time, the .NET remotings and WCFs and of course now Azure and gRPC and all the other cool stuff. So it's a lot of fun.
Cool. Yeah, and there you mentioned CSLA, which I believe is part of the topic for today, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
CSLA and my current favorite UI framework, which is Blazor. So
awesome. We like Blazor around here.
Yep.
Cool. So yeah, let's talk about it. So what exactly is CSLA? What does that stand for? We have too many acronyms around here.
Well, so CSLA was an acronym back when acronyms were cool, I guess, if they ever were. And SOAP used to be an acronym, and then SOAP stopped that and became a word.
Right.
So yeah, that's CSLA stopped being an acronym and became a word, if you will. So it doesn't really stand for anything anymore, other than it's the product name that I've kind of become stuck with over almost 30 years. So
cool.
But what CSLA is focused on is helping you. So the way I look at it is that we've got all these fantastic UI frameworks, and we've got lots of data access frameworks and tools and all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. What doesn't really exist is any sort of framework or tooling to help you create a consistent business layer. And so every line of business app, that's my career, has largely been building complex line of business apps in all sorts of industries. Every one of those has complex business logic. And so where do you end up? If there's no defined place to put it, it ends up behind button click events, or maybe it ends up in stored procedures, or some random mix of all of those, or it ends up being written in a controller. Basically, it ends up places where it should never be. And so CSLA's purpose in life is to give you a home for that business logic that's independent from any presentation technology and any data access technology.
Perfect. So it's in its own separate space. It's not necessarily going to conflict with other things if you were to just haphazardly put some of that functionality in.
Hopefully not.
Ideally anyway.
We work hard to kind of provide tooling bridges or framework bridges for all of the major UI frameworks that are out there, and also some level of bridging to some of the data access frameworks. So, but for the most part, it's independent of either of those, or tries to be. The UI stuff is interesting because CSLA has been around for so long. It was originally written to work with Windows Forms, and Windows Forms data binding was complicated,
right?
And idiosyncratic. That's even a better word. And then Web Forms was much simpler, but had its own idiosyncrasies. Then WPF comes along, totally redefines the way data binding works from Windows Forms. Some of the best practices for like raising events were reversed, and stuff. And so CSLA actually has a lot of behaviors built into it to try and mitigate those differences, so that if you started out, and this is the goal kind of, right? You started out writing your app and you use Windows Forms, then you said, oh no, we want to move to WPF. You should be able to do that with minimal code changes to the business layer, right? Obviously you're rewriting your UI. But to make that sort of thing work efficiently, CSLA literally has to understand what UI framework you're binding to so it can change its behaviors. And of course now, you run all the way up into Blazor, which has a whole different binding, model and set of expectations. And so it's been a fun journey.
Cool. Yeah. So I'd love to see some of that journey in action.
Sure.
What you got?
So what I've got here is it is the sample Blazor app, the simplest one. There's a more complex one, but we're going to stick with simple.
All right.
That is in the CSLA GitHub repo. Before I actually get into that, just very quickly, you can go to cslanet.com. That's the landing page. You can go to the CSLA GitHub repo, which is linked off from that. Get all the source code and everything like that. And in here, there's a samples directory that has a whole host of different samples for all sorts of things, Maui and WPF and Blazor and all the fun stuff. So if we go back here, and I'll just run this so that we've got a frame of reference as to, this is not a complicated app, right? That's kind of the point, is that it's a learning, start point for learning. So we can, for example, get a list of people, and this came from a database or a mock database, and
Toy Story database.
Yeah, that's exactly. You read my mind. So I can say, oh, I'd like to edit. There was a flicker there. I'll come back to exactly why that is. That's some cool, or not cool. It's some Blazor stuff that came with Blazor 8. But you can see we're binding to some sort of a edit person object that's got an ID. It's got a name. We're keeping track of the number of characters that are in the name. We can tell whether this object is a pre-existing object or is new. In other words, we don't believe it exists in the database yet. And then whether it's currently savable. And so what that means, this for example, if I back up here, has a error level rule that says the name is required. So now savable is false.
Right.
And that
Which
also
updated on its own.
It did. And it's bound to the button. Although I'm told now by several people that this disabling the button like this on a web page is bad for accessibility. I don't know if that's true or not. This is what I've been told. It might be.
I feel like it might depend on like what screen readers are doing.
That's what
something related to that.
That was kind of what it was related to.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was interesting.
That is interesting. I think that's an interesting point.
Most of my demos do this because it's like, oh, isn't that cool?
Right, yeah.
It's like, yeah, you can't save it, so we'll tell the user, But now if I type Andy, but I don't uppercase the letter, now we can see that there's another warning level rule. So now it's savable. I can save this thing, but it's got that yellow text there that's saying, oh, hey, that first letter probably should be uppercase, but we don't know for sure. And then the blue text never goes away. That's an information level rule. And so this really highlights because again, CSLA is about rules and business logic. And so from a validation perspective, it has error warning and informational severity rules that you can have. The other thing that's happening, if we watch that name length field, make up a last name, the name length is automatically changing. That's also being implemented through a rule. And so it's simplistic, but the idea being that as the user is manipulating fields on the form, you might be triggering things that are recalculating discounts and totals and insurance rates. And we don't the rules can be arbitrarily complex. This one just happens to be super simple. So if I now save this person, we're back to, we've saved it. Yay, that's pretty cool. Now I'm going to get into the code here in a second, but the other edit here is this is something we just recently have been starting to add, and that is because Blazor has this concept built in called an edit form. And so using the edit form, you can't get everything, but if I tab off the field now, the save button disables because there's a broken rule.
Right.
But there's not the edit form, and in fact all the validation stuff that's built into Blazor only understands errors. It doesn't know about warnings or information level messages. And so, and I can do a save. And so it's not to say that you shouldn't use an edit form, because you can tap into all the CSLA stuff, but it's not automatic. And that's kind of the point of what's being demonstrated here. So if we go back and look at the solution here, just at a high level, zoom in here a bit, this started as the standard .NET 8 Blazor example template, right? So it's got the server-side project and a client-side project that can, and in this case does, run in WebAssembly. That's part of that flicker. I'll come back to that still. We've got a DLL class library that contains all the business logic. We've got a data access abstraction layer, and then two implementations, one that uses Entity Framework and another that uses a mock database, which right now it's running off the mock database because that's simple and straightforward for demo purposes anyway, right? And so if we kind of start where CSLA is focused at the business library, we can see a number of different types that are available here that are being bound to the UI. So there's that person list class that is the list of people that we see on the first screen, and it is a list of person info objects. And then there's a person edit class that has all of this, editing behavior to it. And the rest of these classes are all the rules that are being enforced. And the idea here is that a rule is a class, and that makes rules testable, independent of what properties or anything they might be attached to. So you might have a rule that validates zip codes, and then you might expand out of the US into, say, the UK, where the postal codes are completely different.
Right.
So then you can alter or maybe even create a new, but whatever set of postal code rules, unit test the heck out of them so that you know that you're good in the US and the UK, and then attach the rule back to your postal codes anywhere in your app, and then the rules will automatically be enforced. So this is kind of the philosophy behind this, is to elevate rules to a first-class citizen.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense.
And so if we look quickly at, ooh, hey, that font.
So that was small.
Okay. So we have a class here that's inheriting from something called business base, and CSLA has a set of base classes that you inherit from to tap into all of its behaviors, read-only classes and editing classes and so forth. And then it uses a structure here that's very consistent for declaring properties, based loosely or inspired, I guess, by WPF, the idea that you've got a static field that describes the property, and then the property itself is always calling into the framework to do all of the real work. And what this is great, because you can use a variety of code generation tools or code snippets. And in fact, something that I just accepted an initial PR as a prototype is something that we're working on as a code generator, using all the new code generation features that are built into .NET to actually allow this code to largely be generated on your behalf. So it's very exciting stuff, I think, anyway. But notice that all these properties are the same. So there's high levels of coding consistency here. But then we can also start getting into some business rules. Again, we're talking about business logic. And so this is a required field, which we saw, right? The red error text. But then we can come down here and come down a little bit further, and we can see that actually we've got the information text attached to the name property. That check case, the warning rule, is attached to the name property. For some reason in this application, it's a demo. We don't allow Z's in the name, so that's a rule. And then there's a rule that counts the number of letters in the name. And so then we can look at each of these.
I'm wondering, are there,
go ahead.
regarding rules, are there cases where you might want to prioritize one rule over another? Like, can you rank
Yes,
in terms of
absolutely.
Like, focus? Cool.
Yep. And that's very, very common. So you'll often prioritize all of the simple validation rules to run first. And then if any of those fail, then none of the other rules run. And the whole point of that is that you might have a bunch of validation, and if any of those fail, you're done.
Right.
But if they all succeed, then you're going to run some rule that has to run out to the database and verify some values or something that could be quite expensive, or a calculation that's
Totally.
quite
You don't want to
expensive.
run that over and over again for no reason.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly right. And this demo doesn't go into all of that. There's the rules engine, as you would hope, is extremely sophisticated. So not only does it do the priorities, but rules can be synchronous or asynchronous, which is obviously pretty important in today's world. So you can have asynchronous rules. You can have multiple sets of rules because that's necessary in a multi-tenant scenario, so that on my server, you might be coming from one tenant or company and I'm coming from a different one, so we can have completely different sets of rules for each of, or well, maybe not for each person, but for each tenant, right? But at the end of the day, the real key here is that every rule implements iBusiness rule, or more simply often inherits from business rule. It says that it's, in this case, going to be attached to our primary property, and then we're going to display some text. And then the rule has an execute method that's invoked by the rules engine. So there's a whole set of behaviors built in around the life cycle of a CSLA domain object that trigger the rules at appropriate points. Hopefully in some reasonably optimized way, as we talked about, right? So you're only running the rules you need. But this is like the simplest thing in the world, which is we're just saying, hey, we want to add this output text as information. This could, of course, be add error text, or it could be add warning result. So that's validation rules. That's hopefully simple, straightforward, makes a lot of sense. But if that's all it was, that wouldn't be actually all that interesting, I don't think. So here's the letter count, which hopefully everybody can have a imagination thing here. So we're saying, this is attached to a primary property, but it also has an output property, because we're going to look at one or more properties, in this case one, and then we're going to change one or more output properties. And so in this case, we're saying, well, we're going to this rule will affect the output property. And then when it gets executed, it's going to go get the target property, find out its count, and then it's going to add an output value to that affected property.
Cool.
And
that's what we saw in the
form.
Cool.
Yep. And just from an imagination perspective, I mean, this just reads one property and outputs one, but you could read any number of properties and output any other number of properties. Plus, you can access what's called the object graph. So this is simple because this is just one object for editing a person, but you could imagine instead what we've got is an invoice, and an invoice has line items, and the line items have detail items. And so when I'm editing a detail item and I change something, it might need to look throughout the rest of the object graph in order to recalculate something on that line item. And that's absolutely accessible from within the execute method.
Yeah.
So now the way that, bringing this back to a Blazor perspective, just very quickly, if we look at the edit person razor page, it's a pretty standard Blazor razor component. Got a couple routes, navigation manager. We are injecting some CSLA services so we can interact with this thing. Here's where that flicker comes in. This is right, and I think we're probably closing in on our end of our time here, but typical with Blazor, when you go to display something, you say, well, do I yet have data?
Right.
And if I don't, I'm going to be loading it. But if I don't have data here, I might say that I'm loading person if I'm authorized. Otherwise, I'm going to say I'm not authorized. But this page, if I go back up to the top here, doesn't have, it's got commented for conversation point, but basically it's using the auto rendering mode that's in Blazor 8, which means that the first time it renders, it's rendering using server-side rendering, and then it will flip to WebAssembly when it can.
Right.
And so what happens here, and in real life you wouldn't show the flicker, but for my demo I do. So what happens is it runs on the server, loads the model, and then down here we can see how it's binding everything to the model. Okay. But then when it flips to WebAssembly, then it's going to come back up because now it's on WebAssembly. It doesn't have the model anymore because that's on the server. And so we're going to be back here. But the other interesting thing is that there's nothing in Blazor to automatically move the user identity from the server to the client. So what the flicker occurs because we go, oh, authorized? No, we're not authorized. But CSLA behind the scenes is actually making an asynchronous call to pull a copy of the user identity down on your behalf. And so almost instantly, it redisplays like this. But because that's async at the same time that we're actually getting the data, what the user really sees is this, immediately followed by seeing the actual person screen. Right? Now, were I doing this for real life, obviously I would change the UI to not show that flicker.
Sure.
But I think it's actually kind of cool to see how neat Blazor is in terms of like, bam, there's the user able to interact with the screen. And then when the WebAssembly stuff is downloaded, it transparently switches and the user is now running on the client.
Yeah.
And in a client server mode, much less server. I mean, this is part of what gets me all excited about Blazor, to be honest.
I think that is cool. And like, yeah, with the render modes, I think that's a great way of showcasing kind of just what actually is happening with render modes. Because sometimes it can be hard to fully
You got to wrap your head around it.
Yeah, I'm a visual person, so
me
I
too.
think that's just helpful from a learning standpoint too.
Absolutely.
So. Cool.
So I think that pretty much, I mean, obviously there's tons more I could talk about, but this gives a nice taste. Right?
I like this. I thought it was a great little teaser, especially for people who have business logic across their web apps, which I imagine is a lot of people.
I would think so.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that is a really important thing to have. So for people to learn even more about CSLA, where can they go?
The best place to go is definitely go to CSLAnet.com. And from there, you can get to the GitHub repo. We've got a very active discussion forum on the GitHub repo. And there's also a link to a Discord server, which is also quite active. So there's
cool. And this is all open source too.
All open source.
Yeah. Yes. So anyone can go contribute to this if you're feeling passionate.
Please do. That'd be awesome.
Great. And anything else that you want to plug? Anything about you that you want to plug? Like if people wanted to ask you any additional questions and stuff, or CSLA and the Discord and stuff, the best place to go?
Probably. I mean, you can always email me at rocky@latka.net. Cool. And I'm happy to, talk to folks around Blazor and CSLA and we were talking about cloud earlier before the video. Anything to do with Kubernetes and Docker and cloud, I'm involved in all that sort of thing. So I love it.
Awesome. Cool. And of course, if you want to learn about Blazor, if you haven't been doing some Blazor stuff already, there's plenty of documentation for that as well. You can go to MS Learn, or just Google Blazor. I think it would pop.
There's lots of great material.
Yeah.
Yes.
Or apologies, Bang Blazor. Cool. Well, thank you so much for being here, Rocky.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Sweet. And yeah, go try out CSLA and Blazor, or both, ideally both. Share your feedback. And until next time, thanks y'all and happy coding.